Sergeant and Mrs. Smith, you're going to love this house.
Is that a tub in the kitchen?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
You love this podcast. Every episode. Imagine if you couldn't listen to it anymore. Or if you couldn't connect to any podcast. Imagine what you'd miss if you had no internet connection at all. No way of finding a job or banking or seeking medical care online. That's what life is like for the millions of Americans facing the digital divide. Since 2021, AT&T has committed $5 billion to help connect every American, so everyone has a chance to thrive. Now back to the podcast. AT&T. Connecting changes everything.
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
The Athletic.
The Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco.
With the season now behind us, we review the rest of the field behind Red Bull, ask who is best placed to challenge the next season, and tackle more of your tech questions. The 2023 F1 season is now done and dusted, so for the last in the current series of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco, we're going to finish our review of the teams that we started with that in-depth look at Red Bull last time. So there's plenty to get into with the other 9 teams. I'm Edd Straw, but the real star of the show is, of course, Gary Anderson, who has probably endured more F1 seasons than he's had hot dinners. So how are you feeling at the end of that one, Gary?
Yeah, I'm feeling okay. It's it's one of those seasons where obviously Red Bull have dominated. You can't take that away from them. They just simply did a better job than the other teams, or at least Max Verstappen did. I mean, I keep saying this, if you take Max out of the equation and have Sergio as your number one driver, it's not quite so simple. But any team will always be led by the lead driver, and that's obviously what they've done. They've been led by Max. They've developed the car characteristics that suit him. And in reality, that if they do that, he gives them back something. Or Sergio doesn't seem to always give them back something. So at the end of the day, I think that's the right direction. It's up to drivers to adapt themselves to those driving standards or those driving requirements to sort of join the club. So you can really say well done to Red Bull. They've done it all the way through the year, which is impressive. I mean, Singapore was a little bit of a blip, but it was a little bit of a blip. So you need those now and again, I think, to just make sure you learn about it, because they will happen. And you need to make sure how you regroup after them. And they obviously showed that they can do that pretty well. So never mind the domination for the rest of the season, the other more or less 21 races, they will have learned a bit from Singapore that will put them in a better stead for the future.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is, without those setup problems they had in Singapore, they probably would have won all 22 races. But 21 out of 22 is pretty good, isn't it? But we'll hopefully have something a little bit more competitive next year. But I'm sure Red Bull will be a formidable force. But as always, in the first part of this podcast, the playing field is free for whatever topic has grabbed your attention. So what's on your mind, Gary?
Well, I'd like to sort of work out how they can make sprint races, which we're having 6 of next year, more of a feature within the weekend, the Formula One weekend, as opposed to being just a one stint race as such. At the minute, it's that's all it is. It's a shortened version of a Grand Prix. Because it's before the Grand Prix, it sort of highlights how the Grand Prix is going to unfold, or more or less highlights how the Grand Prix is going to unfold. So I would change it a bit. I'd change the whole weekend structure a little bit. There's many things I'd like to do with the regulations, but obviously sprint races are the highlight at the moment, and I think we'll just focus on that a little bit. So for me, we have a situation where, do we have Saturday and Sunday race weekends? Forget about Friday. At the moment, we have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we need to make it a spectacle for the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And that's how some of the circuits, make some money, basically, by having people come there on the Friday. Sometimes there's not too many, but it gives you a run into the show. So for me, the first practice session on the Friday would be a 1 hour practice session, but it would be for each team has to put in a driver that's not done more than 2 Grand Prix over the last year or 2 years or whatever, so that you get the new guys coming in and being introduced to Formula One. If you don't put in a driver that's done less than 2 Grand Prix over the last couple of years, then you don't run your car. It's quite simple. You keep it in the garage if you want, because the public in general want to see cars running, but they really want to see their hero driving the car. So there sometimes will be, a team would say, oh, well, I don't want to run the risk. Well, okay, you learn nothing then. The car is parked in the garage. So for part 2, it will be another free practice session on the Friday afternoon. And it would be for the Grand Prix drivers, your contracted team drivers. So that would be, the first time they hit the track. We want to limit the amount of time, basically, that they get on the track a little bit, just to make sure that it's a tougher job come Sunday. So that's Friday over in Bournemouth. So the first practice session is for drivers that have done less than 2 Grand Prix. The second practice session on the Friday is for your Grand Prix drivers. Then you get to Saturday morning. Saturday morning is qualifying. And qualifying consists of more or less what we have now. First session is 20 cars. Out you go, and you that is your, as you have now, 20 cars. Let's say it's 20 minutes long, just for nice round figures. And at the end of that then, because all cars are out in the track, that then becomes the grid for the sprint race. But it's the grid for the sprint race reversed. So in other words, if you want to play around with trying to be 14th or 15th or something in Q1, you run the risk of not being at the front for the main Grand Prix. You run the risk of being put out of the session because you're in the back 5. So that first session, 20 cars running on the track for 20 minutes, becomes a bit of jeopardy as to where you want to put your focus. So the running order at the end of that is the sprint race, which will be on Saturday afternoon in reverse order. You then go to Q2, which is 15 cars. The 5 slowest ones are parked up. You have 15 cars out for 15 minutes. And again, then you have the Q3, which is the 10 cars out for 10 minutes. You lose the slowest 5. And then for Q4, you have the 5 fastest cars going for a 1-lap shootout for 5 minutes. So basically, you've got 5 minutes, you've got time for one warm-up lap and one timed lap. And that's it. That's your grid. The 5-car shootout at the end of it is for pole position for the Grand Prix. The 20-car run at the beginning is the grid for the sprint race, but reversed. And that will force teams to build cars that are actually a little bit better in traffic. The moment it's all about having a fast car and getting on pole and getting out the front and winning the race. It's not about trying to make cars or build cars that are actually good in traffic. So that situation, in my book, would be a different spectacle for the sprint race as opposed to being just part 1 of a Grand Prix. They need to make it different, and that would make it significantly different.
Yeah, that is interesting. So it creates a little bit of risk and jeopardy if you want to strategize it. And actually, the point about making cars that are more benign in traffic is an interesting point, because there's all this focus on trying to calm the wake. But obviously, the wake is going to be there, isn't it? It's the laws of physics. You can adjust it a bit, you can move it around, you can control it to an extent, but it's going to be there, isn't it? So there are those who will argue the solution is actually in the cars being more robust, and creating a bit more design incentive could be an interesting way to do that.
The way the regulations are now, there is no incentive for the teams to make cars that are better in traffic, because it's all about, statistics say it. If you're not at the front, the chances of winning the race are pretty remote. So you have to build a car that's fast enough to get at the front. I've always said that I wouldn't mind seeing reverse grid Grand Prix, but I think that's a bit dramatic. I don't mind seeing racing, but the problem is that if you have, for example, if you take the top 10 and reverse them, you've just sort of made the fact that the slowest 10 cars don't really matter. You're just saying the top 10 reverse. So in other words, the fastest car for the Grand Prix ends up in 10th on the grid. It just sort of dilutes what the 11th to 20th are all about. So I think, unless you reverse the complete grid, you might as well not bother. I would love to see, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, whoever, coming through from the back and ending up the 5th, 6th and 7th after having passed a lot of cars, than them, just dominating the race A from the front, or B, starting from 10th and as we've seen in many occasions, still been able to win the race. So it's one of those sort of things I want to see the battle. And the sprint race gives an opportunity for that to happen. And it separates it from the Grand Prix. It makes it a completely different event as such, which is what we need. We don't want to be part one of a Grand Prix. It's like watching something on television. You watch the first episode of it, and the second episode, if it was just the same, you wouldn't bother. And that's what we get now. We just have this repeat of what happens on the sprint race. So I think it needs to be separated. And I think if you're going to do the reverse grid part, which I think there's talk about, you need to reverse the complete grid, not just part of it. And you need to give the small teams that haven't got the coverage, I suppose you might call it, give them coverage by having them on the front of the grid. There's no reason why, the teams that are not at the front of the grid can't be able to race well. It's about defence. It's you don't block anybody because you get done for that. You have to leave space. DRS means that there will be overtaking. So at the end of the day, I believe that a solution like that would make qualifying for the Grand Prix and the sprint race within the same schedule quite an event. And B, it would, as I say, separate the fact that the sprint race and the Grand Prix at the moment are basically the same. We want something different.
Yeah, I certainly 100% agree that the sprint needs to be something distinct, which it just hasn't been so far. It's either been the first part of the Grand Prix or just a completely irrelevant Saturday, as it's been over the course of this year. So it's going to be 6, as you said, next year in China, Miami, Austria, Austin, Brazil, and Qatar. And obviously your solution gets around one of the things I dislike about the reverse grids thing is I'm not fundamentally objecting to reverse grids for the sprint, but I don't really like it when there's a qualifying session for it. But what you're suggesting there is a way to make that work. So it's an interesting proposal. And these will be the sort of things that F1 will be thinking about. But it is strange, isn't it, Gary? Because they come up with this big change and they have the chance to do something different, something more extreme. And then it progressively gets watered down, doesn't it? Because they ended up making the sprints as similar as possible to the regular races. And in fact, they took out a lot of the things that they've introduced in recent years to try and liven up the Grand Prix itself. So it's quite a bit of a case study in the way F1 works, isn't it? That there's, here's this great idea, and then the teams will push back and make it as conservative as it possibly can be.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit sad, because I think sometimes you need to sort of see the big picture. I personally like racing. I like watching the race. Qualifying, the event of qualifying it's pretty good. But it's an exciting sort of time, that 1 hour, the three qualifying sessions. But there can be a little bit more, and as I say, that one lap at the end for the fastest 5 cars, just continues what they're doing really, with the slowest 5 disappearing at the time, and it just means that right at the end, you've got this one set of tires, you've got to make it count, and that's for the main race, and we're all happy that the main race is the fastest cars at the front. It's not necessarily right, because then we try to breed artificial overtaking, which is you're sort of saying to a slower car in theory, or potentially an overall slower car, but a tire that might just be a little bit better on its tires with DRS, that you can come and potentially overtake a faster car. And that's a bit sort of, to me, a bit of a grey area. But I think that having the grid reversed from the first session of qualifying, from the 20 cars running, is quite good, because if you try to get clever and put yourself in a bit of a difficult position by hovering around that 14th, 13th, 15th area just to try to be better up the grid for the sprint race to get some points, then you do run the risk of not being there. So I could quite happily say that if the teams are clever and you do it that way with the first session 20 cars in reverse grid order, you will see most of the quick guys hovering around the middle somewhere, around the 10th, 8th, that sort of area, just making sure they're in the middle of the grid for when the sprint race starts, so they do have a chance of winning it, which is good. But it's at least it gives some of the smaller teams that opportunity to get to the front. So, I think it satisfies everybody. And as I say, I keep saying, as you said as well, it will be a different race to the Grand Prix. It won't be just the same. It'll be a whole different set of requirements, from the driver and from the team, how they set the car up, all that. So the points at the end of the sprint race need to be reasonable. Maybe it needs to add a couple more points on for the guy that wins it, because you would hope that somebody who wouldn't be in line for scoring good points on Grand Prix Sunday, that they might actually drag some decent points out of sprint Saturday. So for me, as I say, the qualifying would be Saturday morning, the sprint race would be Saturday afternoon, and then the Grand Prix Sunday as normal.
Yeah, and certainly I think the question of points in a closer championship, the points will become more significant, won't they? Obviously, this year, no amount of points would have made the sprint particularly significant unless I don't know, we're giving 100 points for a win, probably. So it was never going to matter. But yeah, certainly agree, making it significant and making it different, because I think if you're going to just echo the Grand Prix as it has so far, you might as well just not do it at all. So some interesting ideas there. Interesting to see what F1 comes up with. It's probably going to be late January before they finalise the format, because why would you work it out in good time well in advance of the season when you can leave it to the last minute and then say you've run out of time and come up with something that's a bit half-baked? But I don't know, maybe they'll surprise me, but we shall see. Let's get on to our main topic, which is a look at the 9 losers, so the teams who couldn't get close to Red Bull most of the time. And first up, we'll start with the nearest challengers, although realistically they were neither near nor actual challengers in Mercedes and Ferrari. But that battle for second place was very close. It went down to the last lap of the last race. It was won by Mercedes. Would you say that says Mercedes had the better car, did the better job, developed better over the season compared to Ferrari?
No, I would say actually completely the opposite. I think Ferrari did a better job. And the reason I say that is because you've got to look back and, over those last few races, basically Ferrari suffered a lot. I mean, Leclerc in Brazil, when he went off and warm up lap, didn't have a chance to score any of the points that he potentially could have done. Carlos Sainz with his grid place penalty in Vegas, and there was a race prior to that where Sainz didn't participate at all because of a fuel problem. So they lost, just simply they lost a lot of points through, in reality, yes, it is a fault of their own. Obviously, it's always a fault of the team, but through no real fault of their own, they were more competitive. And I think Mercedes, to be honest, I didn't see them getting better during the season. I believe that Ferrari at the end of the season moved in the right direction. The car got more driver friendly. And when the car is more driver friendly, the driver can put it more on the limit without the risk of always ending up in the barrier or potentially ending up in the barrier. So I believe personally that Ferrari did a better job, and that Mercedes were quite lucky whenever Ferrari didn't score decent points in those races where they had problems even before the start of the race. So, we had a situation where Mercedes made such a big deal of the car at Austin, how the improvements were not really going to be lap time, but it was the direction for next year, and it was to confirm that their direction was in the right direction. And obviously after the race there, both Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc got a car thrown out for the plank wear. So they both lost out because of that. But from a car that in Austin, Lewis Hamilton was raving about, to a car in Brazil where he was just, thought was diabolical. It's a strange end to the season for a team. I think on the other hand, Ferrari were going the right direction. Leclerc was much happier with the car at the end of the day with their floor modifications, and that takes them into the winter with a little bit of confidence in the direction they're going in.
When you look at the overall position of those teams, what you've learned from their cars, which one do you think's better placed to challenge Red Bull next season? I guess that's based on what we know they've got back at base and also the understanding they've shown through the car. Does one or the other stand above the other in that regard?
I think the understanding that Ferrari have of the car is better. I think there's room for Ferrari's, concept's a big word because we only see what we see. But in making the car more driver friendly at the end of the season by underfloor changes, which we don't see, other than the outer edge of the floor and how they manage the airflow down the side of the car, by making the car better for the driver and more consistent, with, as I say, developments that we don't actually see, I think that they have a handle on how the underflow needs to work. And I believe that the visual concept that we see, they can optimize it a little bit. I think, and it's easy to say the Red Bull radiator intake duct is really good, blah, blah, blah. But what it is, the good part about it is that whenever the radiator blocks up, which it does at speed, and it just basically can't flow all the flow you're firing at it through the radiator intake, it has to spill off somewhere. On the Red Bull, they manage that quite well. It spills off over the top of the side pod. So it doesn't affect the airflow structure underneath through that undercut side pod area and down the side of the car. It's consistent there, even when the radiator, even from low speed to high speed, it's consistent, because at low speed the radiator can flow all the air that's thrown at it, but at high speed it can't. And what you want to do is make sure that doesn't affect the rest of the car. On the Ferrari, they have a sort of eyelet inlet, I suppose you might call it. So the flow that's being spilled out of the radiator intake coming around the side, high up. So it's not got a big effect on the undercut of the side pod or the floor edge, but it still has an effect. So I think there's room for improvement in what I call the visual concept on the Ferrari in a reasonable way. And if they can do that in conjunction with the understanding they have from the last few races of how to make the underfloor work and give the driver confidence, in other words, have an underflow that the centre of pressure moves rearwards with speed, it will be a big help. Now, saying that the centre of pressure moves rearwards with speed, that's not really true. The centre of pressure needs to move rearwards as the gap to the ground gets smaller. That's the big thing, because speed dictates that there's more load in the car from the wings. It pushes the car near the ground, and then you generate more downforce. And what you need to make sure when that's happening, that the centre of pressure on the car is moving rearwards and not moving forwards. So that's Ferrari. I think they have room for improvement. They don't run with as much anti-dive on the front suspension as the Red Bull, so they've got a bit of improvement there. The rear suspension, they do have some anti-lift on it, but not quite as much as the Red Bull. And to be honest, to optimise that and make use of that to control their platform will again give them a little bit of an advantage. Now, moving on to Mercedes, they've gone down the wrong path with how they comply with the side impact structures, and they've incorporated the side impact structure into what was sort of their wing mirror mount, which has meant that they can't really do much with that radiator intake on the current car. That concept of radiator intake that the Red Bull or the Ferrari have, because they have to connect the side pod to that wing mirror mount to comply with the side pod regulation. So they got themselves boxed into a little corner. So for them, it's a much bigger step for them to take to get back to follow the path that Red Bull have set, or even Ferrari have set with that radiator intake detail. They went the other route of minimising the side pods, sort of basically taking them off and saying, I don't have any side pod here. But that doesn't allow you the side pod undercut, the detail down the edge of the floor, to manage that flow down through the side of the floor. So you need to have some of these things to actually help manage the flow and get the airflow structure in the right areas. Because if the airflow is losing its velocity and it's losing its energy, and sometimes you have to use the bodywork to manoeuvre it and give it a little bit of help, to sort of push it around that corner a little bit. So I think Mercedes need to take big steps before they can become, let's say, Red Bull competitive. In the fact that what they've got obviously suits some circuits, and we see that quite often. But what they've got also is very confusing. They don't know why it's quick and they don't know why it's slow. So that means that the downforce that they produce isn't consistent, and they need to sort of get on top of that. And they didn't show that to me right at the end of the season, because when the drivers say in Austin the car was mega, and in Brazil the car was terrible, they're both basically the same car, just a slightly different track. Now, if you look at other teams that are competitive, i.e. Red Bull or Ferrari, they're there at both events. They're in competition at both events, so they have a better understanding and better consistency from their package. Mercedes have very little understanding and very little consistency. So Mercedes have a lot of work to do to get that consistency.
Well, this is the big problem, isn't it? That Red Bull have such a command of the demands of the regulations. They've been on the right track right from the start at the beginning of last year, that catch-up process is very difficult. Both Ferrari and Mercedes have talked about how next year's car is going to be brand new, all new components, big architectural changes. So they know the areas they need to be working in. But it's probably quite a big ask to expect a big change of direction that will instantly yield enough performance to be there at Red Bull's level. Or do you think if they get it right, there's enough understanding and knowledge available to them that they should be able to do something that bothers Red Bull?
Oh, there's every opportunity for both Ferrari and Mercedes to be a Red Bull challenger. The regulations are the same for everybody. It's about applying them the best way possible. And what I'm sort of saying is, from my point of view, Ferrari they're 9 out of 10 as far as competitiveness relative to Red Bull. And for me, right at the moment, Mercedes are probably 7 out of 10. So Mercedes have more to do to get to the same level as Red Bull. They've got to overcome more problems. And Ferrari have overcome a few of those problems. So either of them should be able to do that. But it's whoever bites the bullet and actually really does get on with it and make sure that they push the limits to the maximum.
Yeah, and that's a big ask, isn't it? So, yeah, both are capable in terms of the resources they've got, and F1 fans will be hoping that ideally both of them get up there. But, yeah, it's still quite a big ask for them. Let's look at the next pair of teams now, McLaren and Aston Martin. We've paired them because not only were they 4th and 5th, but their seasons kind of reflected each other, didn't they? Aston Martin started well and then lost performance relative to the rest. Obviously, they didn't literally go slower, but relative, they were slower. And McLaren started pretty appallingly and then became very, very quick and at times were Red Bull's strongest challenger. So let's look at Aston Martin first. Obviously, you had the influx of personnel. Dan Fallows, who'd worked with Adrian Newey for a very long time, became the chief technical officer, but they've got very, very accomplished people from pretty much every team in the pit lane. Eric Blondin from Mercedes, for example. And they came up with this car that built on the previous years, but that drew in lots of thinking from other teams. Is there a concern that might limit them a little bit next season because they kind of had this car that was the aggregate of all these ideas, and then it needs to become self-sustaining and self-developing, doesn't it? And it was a bit stuttering this year. So how do you see Aston Martin for next year?
Well, yeah, that what you say there is exactly the right problem. You come in with all these ideas that you've gained through your experience with other teams. We've all done it. We always come along and say, well, we did this way and we did that way. But at the end of the day, once you've got that in place, you have got to stand up yourself sometimes and make decisions to take it forward. And you don't get input from the other teams anymore, from your knowledge from them, because you've exploited that. So I think that's probably one of the reasons Aston Martin stuttered at the beginning of the year. They took what anybody would do. They take a car, it produces X downforce, it's got X profile, aerodynamic profile with ride height, blah, blah, blah. And look, we can find another 2 or 3% downforce if we do this to it. And they find that 2 or 3% downforce and the car goes slower. And that's a big learning curve, but it's better to learn it than not learn it. So then by recovering before the end of the season, reasonably, I don't think they recovered 100% by any means. They probably recovered 50%. I think by retesting some of the stuff and recovering as best they could within the season's limitations, they've been able to improve their understanding of what makes a car go quick. And that would maybe keep them away from getting too excited over the winter of these mega downforce cars like Mercedes came up with 2 years ago. As far as they were concerned, they had a car that had 50% more downforce than anybody else. May have been, but if a driver can't use it, it's a waste of time. And in Fernando Alonso, as a driver, they have somebody who's pretty black and white. Again, a bit like Max Verstappen, he doesn't leave any stone unturned. He's a very good driver, I think, for Aston Martin at this point in time, because he's been there, seen that, done that, all that sort of stuff. And, he won 2 world championships, but reality of it is he should have won more. He was very close to winning more. So he's a very, very competitive, hungry animal, I suppose you might call him still. Even at his age. If they hadn't got Max Verstappen in there, and let's say they had just Lance Stroll and their test driver, Felipe Drugovich, they would be standing there scratching their head because they wouldn't really know which way to turn. Whereas at least they've got confidence in Fernando. He's got the experience to have his own confidence. He can say what's good and what's bad. So they've got an ideal situation in the driver lineup with Fernando to make sure that they go in the right direction. So my big worry would be why they went off track mid-season. Okay, there may be reason. They may also need to know the reasons why they couldn't get back 100% to where they were. Time will dictate that, when you're doing development that's in the wrong direction, it means you're losing time because you're not developing in the right direction. So there's maybe part of that. But at the end of the day, they just need to make sure that they take the facts that are in front of them. And they are black and white. They should have taken the facts mid-season when they started the downturn. They should have taken those facts a bit earlier and accepted them. But I think they kept on trying to find the solution to the new developments before they actually really took it on board that they'd gone the wrong direction and they needed to regroup. but they did regrip, and it's okay. Now, I mean, McLaren are the other way around, completely the opposite. They probably didn't quite finish the season at McLaren as strong as they really would have liked to, but they started the season really badly, and they took steps through the season that basically led them to a very good performance car. Car that they say is very good at high speed, but doesn't, and just the downforce at low speed. I keep arguing there is no real difference. It's the car doesn't produce the downforce at high ride heights. It produces the downforce at low ride heights, and the two go hand in hand. If you've got a car that produces bucket loads of downforce at high ride heights, you will get into airflow separation problems at low ride heights. If you've got a car that's producing lots of good quality, stable downforce at low ride heights, then it's unlikely to produce high levels of downforce at high ride heights. So the two go hand in hand. You need to find a compromise, and you need to make sure that the underfloor separation problems you're always going to get when something's near the ground, that you manage them correctly, so that at high speed, although the car has got airflow separation, it's not got problematic airflow separation. It's got managed airflow separation, and that will allow you to have a car that produces good downforce at high ride heights for low speed corners, and it will give you a car that produces good consistent downforce at low ride heights when the airflow separation problems step in. So I think McLaren got on top of that a little bit, but not the end of the season wasn't quite as strong as they felt it needed to be.
The interesting thing with McLaren is obviously they made this huge step over the course of the year, but they've still got a car that's famously tricky to drive on knife edges. It's always described, and that, as you mentioned, the slow corner weakness. So when you look at Red Bull's trajectory, they are a team who you could see mounting a challenge to Red Bull next year, but they have these couple of specific weaknesses to tackle. So how easy do you think it'll actually be for them to solve those problems? Obviously, you've covered a little bit the downforce at the higher ride heights for the slow corners, but is that going to be an easy fix without the trade-offs, meaning they're losing some of the other performance? Can you solve all of that in one new car?
Well, you can. As I say earlier, the big thing is the regulations are the same for everybody. So within that set of regulations, Red Bull have proven this is what you can achieve out of it. The first thing to do is recognise who your problems are. And as they're saying, you know, our car's not as good at low speed as at high speed. Whenever they went to Vegas, that was completely the contrary. They were very impressed with their car at low speed. So sometimes you get in this grey area, this cloudiness that sort of says, at a certain track, the car is not good in low-speed corners, but then you go to another track and the car is good at low-speed corners. So it's about, it's about a bit about the package and being able to manage the package in the correct way. If they can recognise the areas that they need to develop, which, as you say, the car has had over the last few years has had this tricky to drive sort of problem and low-speed problem, then you know what you're focused on. You just need to, as I say, you just need to recognise it. And then they've got a lot of clever people. I think that structurally right now, they're in a good position. I mean, I criticise McLaren on many occasions in the past years about them not accepting where they really were and trying to believe their own hype. I think that's gone past now. I think they got through that side of it. And they're at the other side now where results count. They have two very good drivers in the car. I think Piastri is probably leading to Norris making a few more mistakes because he knows there's no hiding place anymore. They've got a driver there that's up and coming, to a fantastic level. So at the end of the day, it's about the team as a group buying into the problem and putting their energies into fixing them. There's no point in making the car better where it's really good. You need to make it better where it's not good. And that's about recognising the problem. They can do it within the regulations. They just got to do it.
And of course, there's 5 other teams. We won't go through all of them one by one, but which of those other 5 teams impressed you the most, or perhaps I should say unimpressed you the least, is perhaps the way to look at it.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, isn't it? To actually assess where they are. If you take Renault, Alpine as it is now, the Renault engine, again, they're up and down a bit like a yo-yo. Some of that blame can be the engine, the power unit. Some of that blame can be the chassis. But altogether, it's up and down like a yo-yo. So I don't think you could put any assessment on it. End of the season there, they were potentially a bit stronger. But driver-wise, they do seem to sort of have a little bit of a problem with each other, and that's never good within a team. But they are a works team as such. They manufacture the whole car, including the power unit, gearbox, the whole bit. So we expect more out of them because of that. They should be in that top bunch, that top 5. They're not, and McLaren are as such a privateer team. So I think for Alpine's big focus at the minute, it is getting to the level of Aston Martin and McLaren. That's where they need to be bouncing around with. Joining Ferrari or Mercedes or Red Bull is a bit far-fetched at this point in time. So they need to be sort of becoming the 4th best team, I suppose, because of what the credibility they should have as a works team. And if you keep going backwards, AlphaTauri, they've had a troubled season with drivers come and go, and broken wrists and whatever you like to call it. Everything was thrown at them. But in general, the car at the beginning of the season was weak. They have a massive relationship with Red Bull, and they should be able to use every nut and bolt that the regulations allow you to use. And then from there on in, that will drive you to an aerodynamic concept that I'm sure they understand quite well, because I think every team maybe understands it quite well. It's just about, actually exploiting it on your car. So AlphaTauri should be able to get themselves up there into that sort of next little bunch, and probably they should be competitive with McLaren and Aston Martin in reality, because they are a privateer team, but they have, as I say, a very close relationship with Red Bull. They can take the whole back end of the car, engine, gearbox, suspension, the whole bit, and bolt it onto their car legally. So why not? That takes us to 7 teams, and then 8, 9, and 10, which are Alfa Romeo or Sauber as it is, Williams and Haas. I think you have to sort of say that the Haas way of going about Formula One, their model is starting to suffer. The consequences of being this little independent team, taking as much as you can from Ferrari, and then doing the rest is really starting to suffer quite a bit. I think the team that's showing them that is Williams. Williams have definitely got their focus on being better now. I think that they've become a stronger team this year. They've got more focus on it. They're not wanting to sort of get results tomorrow. They understand it's a long process, and are willing to build on it. And then again, we've got what was Alfa Romeo, which is really Sauber. They're at a holding pattern at the moment. They're theoretically being taken over by Audi. If I was Audi, I'd be the worried one, because at the end of the day, Audi are coming into Sauber as a major partner, and that major partner needs to come with a lot of knowledge, because Sauber, as they are, haven't really shown that they've got that within themselves. So that's going to be a big challenge over this next season. Those 3 teams to really sort of show that they're worthy of being there. And I think very easily Haas could end up being on the back of the bunch, with Sauber next up and Williams ahead of that. But it's going to be as big a bat at the back as it is at the front.
Yeah, and of course it's still quite compressed, about 1.5% or thereabouts on average performance covering front to back. So quite small performance swings can make a big difference. So there's hope for everyone, but yeah, it's going to be pretty difficult for that group at the back to make a significant step forward.
You're listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Aramco continuously push the limits of engineering excellence. As the global energy partner of F1, they drive a shared vision to real-world innovation that aims to lower emissions, enhance performance, and accelerate human potential. Aramco, powered by HAL.
If you're listening to this podcast, you understand the value of asking questions. At Aramco, answering questions helps them engineer a better future. So if you'd like to know how something works in F1, please send us a question to answer on the next series of this podcast. It can be on anything at all, F1 ancient or modern, some technical question you've always wanted to know the answer to. Gary has the answer to them all. So you can send a written email to podcasts@therace.com, or if you prefer, record a voice note and send that to us, letting us know who you are, and we'll play that in the show. We've got 3 questions to get through through today, and the first is from Brett in Australia, who says, "Hi Gary, thanks for keeping us entertained all year. I'm not sure if it's something touched on previously, but I'm keen to hear your thoughts on F1 doubling down on the hybrid engine for 2026. Lately, Liberty and F1 has really leaned into the show aspect with key examples of Las Vegas and sprint races. So if it's all about show, why aren't they looking at moving back to big screaming V8s? Imagine 18,000 RPM of goodness echoing off the hotel windows at places like Vegas." So the question is, why are they so persistent in keeping hybrids? If you look across the car makers, it seems most car manufacturers are leaning into true EVs compared to hybrids. And with the increased popularity of F1, surely the sport is more about the 300km/h billboards in corporate hospitality rather than being a proving ground for car manufacturers. I had to laugh when Ford announced their Red Bull 2026 deal earlier in the year. They dubbed a V8 V10 over their logo in their teaser video. Doesn't that say it all? So, Gary, F1 and hybrids, what's your take?
F1 and hybrids. I think, currently F1 has to go that direction. And there's nothing wrong with going that direction. Let's take the engines at the moment, the current engine, the hybrid. One of the things that the package that we have is it's 1.6 litre V6 with a turbo. And the turbo was there because it drove the MGUH. And the MGUH was allowed to generate power outside of the amount you're allowed to flow through the battery pack. So that was all well and good. That was a good package. I think right now, for 2026, as the MGUH is taking a dive, they don't want that there anymore because it's just a cost that's not necessary. That they should actually also get rid of the turbo. Because that's the thing, that's the silencer on the exhaust noise. It doesn't really matter if the engine is 1.6 or a V8 or a V10. If you can rev the engine, you will get noise. So it's possible that it could change. They don't have to change it from being a V6. They can keep that V6 and run the revs higher. And then, as I say, with the turbo not there, it would end up being much more noisy. And you can still have the electric package on top of that, which I think, personally, I don't mind. It is a deployment of normal ECU power against electrical power, and you still have to harvest it in some way. So the harvesting motor will obviously be bigger. The output motor will obviously be bigger, which you use the same motor for. So I think the whole thing works out, all right as a hybrid package. I think the stumbling block for me over the past years has been A, the turbo, and B, the MGUH. I think the MGUH was a good idea because it was something that, all the stuff that comes out of the exhaust pipes is wasted. The MGUH was something that gathered that waste to a certain extent, but it's been decided that it's not really worth the complication and that cars aren't going in that direction. So I would love to see, a V6 engine revving to 18,000 with no turbo on it, and limit the fuel tank size so that basically you've got X amount of fuel to take you for X amount of distance. And the fact that you can have more electrical power means that obviously the electric motor and the battery pack and all that has to be a bit bigger. That's the way life is at the moment. Most cars that are out, road cars that are out there, they are hybrid. The decent ones, I've got an electric car. I personally, my wife has got an electric car. And it's an absolute pain to get charged up when you're out and about. It doesn't have a big battery life on it because it was bought as a runaround. But if you ever go out somewhere and want to do some miles in it, you just don't want to know about it. You pull into a petrol station, it's got, 16, 18, 20 fuel pumps, and they might have one EV charger, maybe, if you're lucky. So we're really not in a position to have fully electric cars on the road by any means, but you are sort of in a reasonable position to have a decent hybrid car on the road. So I think Formula One, by being hybrid, is acceptable, but it's not acceptable because of, they need to sort of do something with the noise level and make it into that spectacle. And the second part of your question, that really covers it. You could have the hybrid car and you could have the exhaust noise. So why not get the best of both?
Yeah, that seems a sensible approach, especially as there is this fundamental tension, isn't there, between the show element and needing to be technologically relevant to the manufacturers to get the money in. It's, something F1's always, I guess, struggled with. The next question is one looking backwards a little bit. Comes from a Rollinson who says, Gary, what the hell did you think when you first saw the Tyrrell P34? Was it good luck with that, or we'd better get copying? Will the P34 go down as a heroic failure despite its success in 1976 with a win and 8 further podiums, or a brilliant curio that deserved wider adoption? And for those who don't remember, the P34, of course, was the 6-wheeled Tyrrell with the 4 front wheels. So you'd have been at Brabham when that car first emerged, wouldn't you?
Yes, it's very interesting, really, because actually I was sitting in a pub with my brother-in-law who worked at Tyrrell's. And, we just were having a bit of a conversation over a pint, as you do. And it was one of those sort of things that came up. He said, you'll never guess what we're doing. And my first thing I said to him, you're building a 6-wheeler with 4 small wheels at the front. Semi-joking, but just thinking the way he was talking about it, talking was just like, you'll never guess what we're building. And he was astounded. He just couldn't believe that I'd actually sort of had a guess at this thing. Okay, we go on to the car itself. And obviously, there's reasons for everything. But if I had been trying to do it, I think I'd have gone for the Williams and the March approach, which was to put the smaller wheels on the back, because it's the rear wheels are really a big drag penalty. So it was one of those sort of situations, I think, where, it won a race. So you can't really criticise it that dramatically, but very strange concept. And the fact you had the big rear wheels and those 4 front wheels. And if you look at any cars through that period in time, because of the tyres that you had on them, the cross-ply tyres as such, the cars were always sliding that little bit. They always had that momentum in them. They always had it looked like a little bit of oversteer because of the cross-ply tyres. The slip angles could be quite a lot higher. So I think, with the 4 front wheels, they sort of, 4 any wheels really, different from other cars with other tyres on them, you sort of develop yourself into a box that you really had trouble getting out of, because the tyre development wouldn't necessarily transfer as Goodyear sort of got themselves into a better position with better tyres. For the mass cars, the bigger tyres, you're going to be left behind a little bit. So that's probably one of the reasons why it didn't get better, because the tyre development wasn't there. But it was a bit of a shock, but I did guess it that night in the pub, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, I don't think many would have guessed that at the time. It's certainly a big surprise when it came out. But yeah, the 6-wheelers were an interesting avenue that were closed off before they were really maximised. So it would have been very interesting to see what happened. Particularly had Williams been able to press on with their 6-wheeler. I know Patrick Head wasn't delighted that Frank Williams had agreed to that particular avenue being closed off. And our third question comes from Mike Listmeyer from Pennsylvania, USA, who says, as the final laps of Abu Dhabi were winding down, I was thinking to myself, I wonder how far along the top teams are with their 2024 car developments. I know teams start around the middle part of the season, but from your experience, Gary, how far along do you think the development of the following year's car is, say by mid-late November, and what are the final things that need to be done before it's complete?
Yes, well, if I go back, 20 years, you're right, and you're saying you start the car development about the middle of the season. We would have a sort of routine of you're really getting quite into it by July the 1st, and then you design and build your car and get it ready for the beginning of January. You go and do some testing, you start racing it, you sort of your problem list builds and builds and builds, and your performance list builds and builds. So you sort of try to sort that all out as the early part of the season happens, and you get up to July again and you start again with the next year's car. So it was a sort of 6-month cycle, I suppose, of research and development and car design and car build. 6 months of trying to get the best out of it, and then 6 months starting on the next year's car, trying to fix all the problems. Currently, the teams are so big that, it's a continual process. But it sort of happens in the same way that the percentage of people working on the 2025 car right now would be reasonably small. But it's probably still bigger than we were 20 years ago as a team. You're probably talking 10-15% of the design group would now be working on the 2025 car. and the other 80%, however it be, will be finalising details of the 2024 car, and that sort of percentage changes over again mid-season. As you sort of start to do your initial research in the beginning of the season, you'll wind it up as you get to sort of July the 1st or such, and then it becomes less of a research, more of a detailing. And the big things are the things you got to get built first. So most Formula One teams will be expecting their first chassis, the first gearbox, probably the first fuel tanks to be, not long from now, getting into a van and heading for the factory, or being finally manufactured, because they are the long-term things. So you have to commit to sometimes as I say, the sort of the concept of the car, the general architecture of the survival cell. You have to commit to that quite early, because it takes time to build that. And then as time goes by, you optimize all the little bits around that, the bodywork, the radiator intakes, the radiators, all that stuff. And it's really dictated by the build schedule. So you've got yourself a situation where the car's going to run on X date, and you need to have the car ready for that. So you work that backwards. Making the radiators may take a month. So you have to start your radiator design earlier, and then you have to have the final drawings and the models all ready by a certain date, so it allows the people to manufacture them for a certain date. Because what you really want to do, and what Red Bull have done in the past, and it's helped them a lot, is they've instead of trying to design better stuff, they've tried to reduce manufacturing time. So it's allowed them to design for longer, research for longer, and make the bits quicker. So if you can, out of that month, let's say for a radiator package of manufacturing, let's say you can cut that down to 3 weeks. That means you've got another week in design and research. And that's just fantastic. That's just, ultra important. So it's not always just about making the best thing that you have at that point in time. It's about shortening the manufacturing time, so it gives you more time to research and develop stuff. So I think, at the end of the day, it's still that same cycle. You've got this 6-month period where it's all from July to the car turns its wheels. That's your big final design detail and build program, then 6 months of learning. But during that 6 months of learning now, because the teams are so big, you will have a skeleton team working on, on other ideas for the future. And now with the regulations changing for 2026, you've also got to have a part 2 skeleton team doing a little bit of work. I mean, the regulations have come out. You're not allowed to start your 2026 car until January the 1st, 2025. That doesn't stop you thinking about it. They might not be able to put pen to paper, but you can do a lot of thinking, and you can just get yourself in a good position just by having time to sit down and focus on the regulations. And nobody can stop you sketching on a sketch pad. And there's some people out there that are very good at sketching on a sketch pad.
Absolutely. And of course, it's always worth remembering with the new cars that it's kind of a constant process, isn't it? Because there's a big lag between finishing off your design drawings and having the parts on the car, and you have to strategize how you sign things off to make sure you can get the key aero parts signed off as late as possible so you can get them bolted on, whether it's in testing or early races. So I guess that's the area where it's changed most, just how big a management job that is, simply because you've got enough people that you can have that scale of projects, whereas in the past with smaller teams it was perhaps a little bit more linear.
Yeah, it is. It's always been a difficult one to actually put that process together. The teams I've worked for, we had a lot of manufacturing outside, so you didn't really control all the manufacturing as well as you wanted to. But currently, I'd say, just to sort of sum it up, that if you really got confidence in the car, the last thing you need to bolt onto it is the rear view mirrors, because if your car is quick enough, you don't need to use them. So they don't need to be sitting on the shelf ready to bolt in the car before the rest of the car arrives. So the last thing before you put the car in the truck to go for the first test should be the rear view mirrors. If you can do that, then you've managed your build process pretty well.
Yeah, and of course, this all has such a huge significance because it decides where you are at the start of the season, and it's setting the trend for the upgrades early in the year as well. So it's a very interesting and complicated process now. But what's certainly the case is what's going on at the factories now will have a big impact on the competitiveness next year. And of course, they've got the extra challenge this year of there being a winter shutdown. So there's a mandatory shutdown over the Christmas period as well, so that personnel aren't worked too hard. So yeah, plenty going on. Even though it's the off season, it's a hugely busy time when it comes to finishing off the testing spec and the race 1 spec cars and getting it all built. Well, thanks very much for those questions, and indeed for all the questions we've received this series. If anyone has a question about F1 tech, please send it through to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. They can be as simple or complex as you like, and we'll put them into the pot for the next series. And thanks also to Gary for your vast insight over the course of the series. There's not going to be too long to wait for more wisdom, as we'll be back next year with more from Gary. You've been listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Be sure to like, follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode.
The Athletic.